You're watching the legal breakdown. So, Glenn, we've got two big updates here. So let's hit both of them. First off, Judge Chutkan in D.C. So we've spoken all week about Trump seeking immunity from the Supreme Court for his Washington, D.C. prosecution. If he's granted that immunity by the Supreme Court, his trial effectively ends. So we now have an update from Judge Chutkan in D.C. that might feel a little disconcerting for people. Can you explain what she did here?
Yeah, it feels a little alarming, but it's really not. It's actually Criminal Procedure 101. Here's what happens anytime an appeal is filed. When an appeal of a trial court ruling is filed, the trial court loses jurisdiction. Automatically, it becomes the responsibility of the appellate court, even before they grant review. So, just by application of the basic rules of criminal procedure, Judge Chutkan had to say, okay, my matter stops. We just pause it while the appeal runs its course. But interestingly, Brian, in her order, she said, okay, I've been divested of jurisdiction. Those are the magic words by virtue of the appeal being filed. However, I am not going to cancel all of the dates that are already set, the deadlines for various motions to be filed and various hearings to be held. What I'm going to do is hold them in abeyance, and we'll wait to see how long the appellate process lasts, because maybe we'll still be able to keep those other deadlines in place. So she said, one, I'm only going to hold in abeyance all previously set deadlines. And here is probably the best news. She said, by the way, the gag order remains in place. I do not believe I am divested of my ability to continue to preserve the integrity of these judicial proceedings just because a notice of appeal has been filed. So Donald Trump is still laboring under the original gag order. Now, I will tell you that might inspire more litigation by Donald Trump, but as of right now, he's still gagged.
Now, does the March 4th, 2024 trial date still hold then until we hear otherwise?
I think we take that one day at a time. It hasn't been vacated, so it hasn't been changed. Will it hold? Only time will tell, because if this appeal gets resolved quickly by either the intermediate appellate court or the Supreme Court, then there's no reason the March 4 trial date can't hold. But this is going to be kind of a day-by-day reassessment of what's going on in the appellate courts.
Well, to that exact point, how long could the Supreme Court dawdle here before that trial date eventually gets pushed?
First of all, they can dawdle as long as they want. How long can they dawdle before that March 4 trial date is no longer realistic? I'm just going to have to engage in some informed speculation. I have a feeling if this issue isn't resolved by sometime, maybe even late January, early February at the latest, we're not going to see that March 4 trial date hold. So I think right now it's a push as to whether they're going to get this thing through the appellate process quickly enough to keep that March 4 trial date.
And is there anything to suggest thus far, just based on what we've seen from the Supreme Court, that would suggest whether they're willing to move in an expedited fashion?
Yes, they seem to appreciate the sense of urgency. Why do I say that? Jack Smith filed for this somewhat unusual appeal. He asked to leapfrog over the DC Federal Circuit Court of Appeals and go directly to the Supreme Court. That's unusual, but not unprecedented. And Brian, the very day he filed that motion, the Supreme Court basically accepted it and said, okay, Trump team, we want a response to this motion by December 20th, extremely quick. That suggests that they appreciate the urgency of the moment, and they're not going to dawdle as much as they might otherwise dawdle in their cases.
And so it is possible then that we could see in about a week, we could have both sides have given their responses, and then we could see the Supreme Court rule relatively quickly, or rather quickly, if not that day. And then the issue of presidential immunity will be resolved, and then we can move on with this case in D.C. as far as Judge Chutkan is concerned. Correct?
It could be. It could be that the Supreme Court could decide this issue by the first of the year. I think that's very ambitious, but it's certainly not impossible.
Okay. Now, I mentioned that we have two pieces of news here. The second is that we have an update as far as the DC Federal Circuit Court of Appeals is concerned, because they've weighed in as well. So can you explain what they did here?
Yeah, this is procedurally a little complicated, and it's kind of counterintuitive. So let me break this down. Jack Smith has filed two motions, one in the Intermediate Appellate Court, the DC Federal Circuit Court of Appeals. That's where cases usually get appealed out of the DC trial court, but he filed a second motion with the Supreme Court. Here's what those two motions are all about. The motion in the DC Appeals Court says, listen, in the ordinary course, you all are the ones who would get this appeal. We are asking you to move this at light speed because once you resolve it, it will still have to go up to the Supreme Court. So please set this on an extremely expedited schedule. Motion number one. Motion number two was with the Supreme Court saying, you all have the authority to hear this case right now. You can cut out the middleman. Ordinarily, it goes through that lower appellate court, but it doesn't have to. So Supreme Court, we're asking you to leapfrog it over the appellate court and take it right now. Both of those motions are active. Both of those motions are in play. Well, we just got an answer to one of them, the appellate court motion. The appellate court judges also obviously appreciating the urgency of the moment, granted Jack Smith's motion and said, yes, we will move this at light speed. They want all briefs in, and they want the case to be ready to be argued in that appellate court by January 2nd. They didn't set the argument date, but all briefs are due by January 2nd. That literally means they could hold the argument on January 3rd and resolve it quickly. So that is the track it's on, unless the Supreme Court then grants Jack Smith's motion and takes it away from that lower appellate court altogether. So right now, the music is playing and we don't know when it's going to stop, and we don't know in what court the prosecutors and the defense attorneys are going to sit down and litigate this issue.
But this is kind of like a fail-safe for Jack Smith, because in the event that the Supreme Court were to say, look, let this go through the normal course of action, this has to be litigated first by the appeals court, and then depending on what the appeals court does, we'll maybe take it up after that. Instead of waiting for the Supreme Court to do that, now the appeals court is already doing it. So even while the Supreme Court is figuring out whether they're going to take it up, what they're going to do, the appeals court is getting this whole process done in the event that the Supreme Court says, decides not to take it up. Is that right?
Exactly right. This is Jack Smith going with a belt and suspenders approach. He wants this thing to move through the courts at light speed, regardless of whether it follows the normal course, appellate court, Supreme Court, or the expedited course, jump over the appellate court right to the Supreme Court. But either way, Jack Smith wants this thing to move quickly.
Okay, well, obviously we will stay on top of this as soon as we have any updates here, whether that update is with the appeals court, whether it's with the Supreme Court. But this is, I don't know how to stress enough that this is the major issue here that we're waiting for some resolution for, because if the Supreme Court, if any court really suggests that Trump has immunity to do whatever he wants, then this trial ends. And so, all eyes are on whatever the Supreme Court does on this particular issue. So as soon as we have any update, we'll bring it to you. If you want to follow along, make sure to subscribe. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.